So does selene have a future in our food system? Other than a food ingredient for manufactured foods, just what else could it offer us? I'd say this is the one most likely to succeed.
Why do you say that?
Because of its basic nice taste. It's not full of additives. It doesn't have to be combined with the kind of additives that make people suspicious of industrial food.
But you're an advocate, Sheila, of real food and good food, really. So how does it square with that?
It doesn't make me question my basic premises, but given the world's reliance on monoculture of the feeds, you think maybe this is the one hopeful thing to move people away from that, although my cynicism says, nah, monoculture will go on.
Hey everyone, we have some exciting news from Solar Foods. It looks like Solar Foods is planning to list on the public markets in a matter of months. Rumor has it that Solar Foods is planning to go public on the Helsinki Stock Exchange via a technical listing. So unlike a classic IPO, which you hear many companies doing, where a company raises capital by issuing new shares to the public, a technical listing enables a company to list existing shares on a stock exchange without raising new capital. This is typically done to enhance visibility, provide liquidity to existing shareholders, so think agronomics, or as a strategic move to prepare for future capital raises or acquisitions. CEO co-founder Pasi Venica told Egg Funder News that the reason for listing is access to growth capital to industrialize cellular agriculture, adding that the possible new capital raised later will be used to execute a strategy around biology, technology, and mergers and acquisitions. He did not give a precise timetable but said it would be in a matter of months, adding that a technical listing is quite a fast process compared to a classic IPO. We aim to scale the company towards a true global technology corporation, and listing is a good choice. As a listed company, we would have the ability to raise capital for further growth when the time is right. Then there is an opportunity to grow this into a Finnish significant industrial group, and consumers globally could be part of the story if and when there is interest. This kind of news is exciting for retail investors like myself who are interested in getting exposure to cellular agriculture without necessarily investing in the venture capital model. Is the company ultimately a good investment? I'm not sure. We'll have to see how it goes. I'll probably pick up a few shares whenever they end up doing their technical listing, hopefully within a number of months. The BBC4 in the UK recently did what I think is an excellent interview and factory tour of Solar Foods. It was all done for radio, so I just wanted to take some images and graphs and just looks at how their factory works and try and put that together with their interview. So that's what the rest of the video is about.
This is the main ingredient we have in the process. So instead of any kind of agricultural inputs, this is our input. So electrolyzer is a device where basically water is split with the energy from electricity to hydrogen and oxygen. So the main ingredient from here is hydrogen. Here we are not utilizing the oxygen, so oxygen from the electrolyzer is vented out.
It looks highly energy intensive at this point.
So this is the energy source for the whole process. So this basically is the one which replaces our need for any arable land.
Juha-Pekka Pitkänen is Solar Foods' Chief Technology Officer, a scientist by trade and co-founder of the company. The ingredient that Solar Food makes is called solane. It begins with a microbe found in a secret location on Finland's coast. It's then frozen and cultivated into vast quantities using the processes in this factory. From the electrolyzer, we went up to the third floor to a machine previously found on Apollo 13 spaceflight. We're in the attic, which is just really this vast white-walled room with pipes in the ceiling.
So this unit here is the direct air capture device, so DAC. I like to refer to Apollo 13 movie. So the chemistry is essentially the same as is the CO2 capture in the spacecraft. in the early days and still now. Or let's say that this is the least mature equipment in our process. So everything that you will see today, so the electrolyzer, that has been used since like the 1930s. And then the bioreactors, so they are of course known for beer production, and then the rest of the process is essentially dairy. So there's like pasteurization, separation, homogenization, spray drying. So all of this is for dairy. But the DAC, these are not really available everywhere.
The direct air capture, a sustainable source of CO2 harvesting, only accounts for around 10% of the factory's needs. The rest they buy as waste gas from a nearby power plant. Solar Foods Factory 01, where we are, uses 50 kilowatt-hours of energy to produce 1 kilo of Solane. The company buys renewable energy, mostly wind and hydro generated, so its overall carbon dioxide emissions are low, about 1.5 kilos for every kilo of Solane it produces. Comparing emissions is complicated, but according to a 2018 study published in the journal Science, that compares to about 3 kilos of CO2 for every kilo of peas produced and 204 kilos of CO2 per kilo of beef. Those figures in the journal Science are based on data from 38,000 farms around the world. But the nitrogen the factory needs is made in the same way as the artificial fertilizer used in conventional farming. That's using fossil fuels in a process that creates vast amounts of the potent greenhouse gas nitrous oxide. That's an issue we'll come back to shortly. So on to the next room, where the liquid microbial protein is blasted with air in a machine more commonly used to make milk powder. It was here I got a real sense of the scale of the operation. My powers of description. I think you'd have to look at the photos on the website of this bioreactor and the hundreds of pipes and cables which lead into it. It's a long way from a farm.
Yeah, so in terms of economy of scale, to make it profitable, it would have to be 60 times bigger. So that the Solane powder is essentially just the first example of the products that we can make from hydrogen and CO2 with microorganisms.
And where is it going? Who's using it?
So we have already had some products, test marketing products launched in Singapore.
When do you think you're going to get EU permission?
I think it's about 1.5 years away. And the UK permit, it's also in the process. Let's go have a look at the mineral ingredients.
The factory runs constantly, but to produce a sack of Solane ready to use in food, and it's a yellow powder that looks very much like turmeric, takes around 4 days. Along with CO2, oxygen, hydrogen and nitrogen, some trace minerals are also added to the mix, a mix that has to imitate the exact combination of elements a plant takes from the soil, though here it all has to be added manually.
In the order of what chemical elements we are feeding. So again, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen. So then the next one is sulfur, phosphorus, magnesium, calcium, iron. Then there's like zinc, manganese, molybdenum, copper, cobalt, nickel, boron. So altogether close to 20.
Where are all these from?
All the minerals, they essentially come from mining. They are so tiny amounts, but still you have to have them. Because without them, certain enzymes wouldn't function, and without those certain enzymes, you wouldn't have growth.
Mining for rare earth minerals to make a sustainable food ingredient? Well, some questions about that later. This is a bit like walking into a brewery, isn't it? Yeah. The huge steel tanks where the beer would be being made, but it's not beer.
So now we are here under the pipes. Here in the corner is now the heart of the process, so the big bioreactor, so 20 cubic meter bioreactor where the organism is grown. So the next step is the pasteurization. So this is a heat treatment. So effectively what it does, it kills the organism. So after
if that all sounds a bit complex, just imagine a kitchen blender on a massive scale. In goes the microbe, along with all the ingredients it needs to grow. mostly hydrogen from the electrolyser, carbon from the direct air capture and local waste plant, nitrogen made artificially, oxygen and those trace minerals. Whizzed up, the mixture is then heat treated or pasteurized, like most dairy milk. And that's where our tour ended. At a time when sales of meat alternatives are falling, what makes Solar Foods any more likely to succeed? Tour over, I sat down with co-founder Juha-Pekka to find out. What is it about your business model that's different, say, to corn or the Impossible Burger, that will allow your company to scale and grow when others haven't, in fact?
So rather than aiming for meat substitute, we aim for ingredient. So we would be kind of more business to business, so that they can make the meat substitutes, or they can make ice cream with Solein or pasta with Solein.
Well, what's the nutrient profile? What do we know about whether it's good for us or not?
So the amino acid composition, so of course it has mainly protein, so it's something like 70% protein. It's a complete protein. It's comparable to egg.
Could you make a meat substitute out of this? I mean, I know you make a powder and that could be mixed in.
For sure. Similarly as you can make meat substitute from soy protein or pea protein. The idea for Solein has been that we have not chosen only one food category.
Some people might say that what you have is a product that would tie very easily into the global ultra-processed food market.
I don't think that we would actually attenuate that processing problem. Solein actually contains more than just proteins, so it has, I mean, the yellow color comes from carotenoids, and then it has various B vitamins, it has minerals.
Does it worry you that it might lead to a greater reliance on industrial food?
Can we go back anymore? We are anyway reliant on industrial foods. We are not hunter-gatherers anyway. Over the years, we have been trying to get funding so that we would have a container scale process powered by solar panels, so that we would have kind of a localized production. In the bigger picture, we have to go big to be able to compete with the soy ingredient prices, but then we have also a possibility to go small.
Because in your press release, there is much talk of becoming a multi-billion euro company. I mean, you're quite ambitious. You want to be part of the trillion euro market. You haven't seen the press release?
Yeah.
This is news to you?
No. Yeah, I guess I'm more humble than our CEO. Well, we want to be big, but as a humble Finn, I don't say it out loud.
Could this protein, do you think, be used to replace soy in animal feed, for instance? Couldn't that be one of the most useful ways for it to be incorporated into the food system?
That would be easy, but price-wise, not the first thing to do.
In a sense, what is the point of all this if Soleil is just used as an addition to what we already have got? You know, another kind of ice cream, another kind of pasta, another kind of burger. What's the point of what you're doing?
Eventually, when it scales up, it will start to diminish something else. Of course, now when we start, it is just a drop in the ocean. But nevertheless, if this becomes bigger, so then something else must diminish. Less soy production, is it less animal meat production?
Let's talk about the sustainability in terms of energy. I mean, we've been through the factory and it seems heavy user of electricity. How sustainable are you in terms of electricity for that now? And then the next question is the importance of the nitrogen being made from ammonia, which is the same process as making fertilizer in conventional agriculture, and that is one of the most polluting global warming gases.
Yes, so of course we are as sustainable as the electricity source. We are buying essentially the renewable power, so it's mainly wind and hydro. Ammonia can and will be produced also with renewable hydrogen. So this green ammonia is coming, and it will be the real solution. My understanding, it's possible this year to buy.
CO2 emissions, the people compare what you are producing to a kilogram of beef or a kilogram of plant protein. How does it compare to beef or plant protein?
So compared to plants, the CO2 emissions are 5 times smaller per kilogram, and compared to beef, CO2 emissions are 200 times smaller.
Yes. How do you do your carbon counting?
So we have done the life cycle analysis in collaboration with University of Helsinki. So there's a peer-reviewed publication about the life cycle analysis assessment of solein production. Basically the area and the plant that is consumed by the cow is taken into account. My grandfather was a dairy farmer and I used to live there. So I don't want to vilify Nordic farmers because again, living here this north, it is a challenge. So that we have to survive somehow.
But if lab-grown food comes to dominate our food system, what becomes of life in the countryside? The rural economy, traceable food. I called on Professor Tim Benton, who leads on food and sustainability at the think tank Chatham House, for his take on all of this.
So growing protein on less land, using less water, emitting fewer greenhouse gases is all round a good idea. But of course, as with all of these things, it's not quite as simple as it seems on the tin. People typically eat too much protein. So in the UK, both men and women eat about 50% too much protein. So if we are going to reduce the footprint of our protein use, number one is we can just reduce the amount of protein that we eat without having to have an alternative. The second thing is that the relative footprint might be small for a production of a kilogram of microbial protein. The issue is that the capital costs of building a very large-scale reactor might be in the hundreds of millions. So scaling up to a very large extent so that you can substitute out large-scale animal agriculture, assuming people want to substitute it out, but whether or not they can provide significantly large enough amounts of protein to substitute out as opposed to just kind of tweak some of the recipes in some of the big food manufacturing supply chains is a big question that only time will tell. One of the things about alternative proteins is that they tend to be generic in formulation. It might go into cattle feed, or it might go into generic ultra-processed foods, biscuits and milkshakes and ice creams and so on. And all of that might make those ultra-processed foods cheaper and might encourage people to buy more of them rather than less of them. So therein lies the Jevons paradox, that by making things more available, it doesn't necessarily substitute.
Does an alternative protein made in this way really have it seems from what you're saying it does, a much lower environmental impact than protein coming from cows?
Yes. Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that, because effectively you can produce it with a very close to zero footprint. You can use renewable energy to do the electrolysis of stuff from air that goes into the system. You're using water, but relatively less water than you would do to grow the feed and for the cattle. And so the overall footprint is lower. A good thing, but the question in my mind is this: A, scalability, and B, whether or not production of generic proteins in the long run is a good thing from a systemic perspective.
I mean, those figures are, overwhelmingly impressive, but you're saying that there are things that they do not show you.
The footprint figures are kind of broadly useful, but they're very much indicative, and they do not show the system-wide consequences. Would it actually be a significant greenhouse gas saving? That is a question that is not answered by these relatively simple life cycle analysis type questions.
So what should citizens, consumers, do with this information? I mean, is it as simple as you're saying, eat less protein? Is that it? But I mean, what does eating less protein mean to most people?
Eating less protein is perfectly possible, given that most people overeat in the UK by about 50%. Obviously, elderly and youngsters growing have a higher protein requirement than people of my age. A lot of what those generic proteins go into are kind of snacky type foods, or foods that not are not necessarily positive from a health perspective. So eating healthily, I would say, is the number one thing that people can do. And eating healthily kind of means more fruit and vegetables, more leafy greens, more whole grains, and less meat. And if you do all of that, then you'll have a relatively low footprint.
Back to the factory, we went through one room where they were storing their minerals and saw sacks of magnesium, zinc and cobalt, which are mined. Do you have any thoughts on how that should be considered as part of the overall environmental selling point?
Any foodstuff that you eat, if it is grown from any organism, microbe, plant or animal, will have requirements for minerals, and those requirements for minerals will either come from mineral supplements in animal feed, for example, or they'll come from fertilizer that are put on the soils, or they will come from the soils themselves. And the harder we drive soils, the more we have to replenish those through fertilizer use. So any form of food production will have consequences that require mineral inputs. The health side is going to become a more potent driver of people's choices. There is no reason to think that alternative proteins can't be part of a healthy diet, but under the current way that the market's working, the chances are that alternative proteins will end up being part of an unhealthy diet instead of part of a healthy diet. I think the world is changing very fast, and from the last 20 or 30 years of kind of expectation that we live in an ever globalizing market where the world is at peace and we're just fighting amongst ourselves for economic growth, I think that era is increasingly going backwards. So if you're looking ahead where supply chains are disrupted by climate impacts, where there is more geopolitical competition, perhaps conflict, what should countries do to ensure their food security? Now, I think if you take a food security as part of national security lens, alternative proteins being relatively small footprint, high capital, yes, but relatively small footprint, are a way of countries having a kind of fallback way of producing food that doesn't require huge amounts of land. So I think there is very much a niche for these, but not in the way that market forces are currently aligned. It might make sense much more from a national security perspective to encourage the growth of this sector. So I do think that there is a role for it in future. I just can't see, under the current system, market forces driving this to scale and substituting it for the animal sector, given where we are at the moment. But I think it's inevitable. If the world is going to become more volatile, we are going to have to start worrying about where does our food come from? And if our ports get blocked by storm surges, or if we are caught in the middle of trade wars or real shooting wars, it makes a lot of sense to say we ought to invest in this area because it is a lowland footprint area and we can grow quite a lot of what we would need from a nutritional perspective for the population. So I do think there is a future where it plays an important role, very much so.
Isn't that fucking cool? Like, there's a company just taking CO2 out of the air and making protein with it. Thanks as always for watching, and we'll catch you in the next video.